Chapter 1. The Return to the Shore. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks was the first thing Emma heard as her car rounded the bend and entered the small coastal town. It was a sound she had missed, a sound that had always felt like home, even after years of being away. As she drove down the narrow, sun-dappled streets, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of nostalgia, mixed with an unfamiliar thrill. This town, with its charming little shops, winding roads, and endless view of the sea, was where she had grown up. But now, as an adult, it felt like a foreign land. The life she had built elsewhere, the life she had moved away to create, seemed far removed from the memories of her childhood. Emma parked her car in front of her childhood home, a weathered cottage with a faded blue door and ivy creeping up the sides. The house looked just as she remembered it. Small, quaint, with flower boxes under every window, their contents bursting with color. It had been her mother's haven, and even though it was just a house now, there was something comforting about it. A reminder of simpler days when the future felt far away, like something to be discovered at a leisurely pace. As she stepped out of the car and stretched, Emma inhaled deeply, taking in the salty air. The scent of the sea mingled with the earthy smell of the wet earth, and for a brief moment, she felt like she could breathe again. She had been in a whirlwind for so long, moving from city to city, trying to climb the corporate ladder, juggling friendships that felt more like obligations, relationships that never felt quite right. Everything had seemed so loud, so demanding, and Emma had been exhausted. It had taken months of deliberation and self-reflection before she finally decided to come back here, to take a break, to find her balance again. The town had always been her refuge, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and just be. But even now, as she stood on the front steps of her house, she felt the weight of everything she'd left behind. Returning felt like a return to an old version of herself, one that she wasn't sure she could connect with anymore. But here she was, and no matter what, she knew she needed this. She grabbed her suitcase and duffel bag from the trunk of the car, then made her way up the creaky steps to the front door. It was a simple key, one of the many things that still remained from her mother's life. Emma inserted it into the lock, and the door opened with a soft creak, just like it had 1,000 times before. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood, old books, and memories. The house felt still, quiet, as though nothing had changed in her absence. The familiar creak of the wooden floors underfoot brought her back to the days when she would run through the halls, laughing with friends, hiding under blankets with her mother for late-night movies. She had been close to her mother, closer than most children were, a fact that had made the eventual loss all the more painful. But it also gave her something precious, the memories of a woman who had been her rock, her anchor in a world that often felt unkind. Emma set her bags down in the living room, gazing around at the old furniture that had been arranged just as it had always been. The same worn velvet couch, the same fireplace that had once crackled with warmth during the cold winter nights. The same windows, slightly fogged from years of sea salt and time, offering the same view of the beach and the endless horizon. She sank onto the couch and let her head fall back. She closed her eyes for a moment, just letting the stillness settle in around her. A part of her wanted to collapse into the comfort of this familiar space, to forget the demands of the outside world and just enjoy the peace that came with being here. But another part of her felt restless, like she was waiting for something or someone to break through the silence. The thought of someone pulled her from her reverie. She thought of him then, Jason, her childhood crush, her first love, or at least the one she had imagined was her first love. They had been inseparable when they were kids. He had always been there, running along the beach, building sandcastles, climbing trees, laughing as though the world had no other purpose than to provide them with adventure. But like all good things, those carefree days had come to an end when she had left for college, and they had lost touch over the years. She hadn't meant to lose touch, but life had a way of changing things. College had taken her to another city, her career had sent her across the country, and then there had been the long-distance relationships that had never quite lived up to the fantasy. She hadn't expected much from the men who had come and gone in her life, but they had all held pieces of a life she thought she wanted. A career, a relationship, an image of success. But nothing ever felt quite right. And now, Here she was again, back in this town, with the past lingering at the edges of her memories, just waiting to collide with her present. She pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time. The familiar name hovered in her contacts list. Jason. She hadn't called him. She hadn't even thought about reaching out. But now, standing here in the same place they used to meet all those years ago, she found herself wondering what he was doing. He had stayed in town after all these years. He had inherited his family's small marina, the same place where they had spent so many afternoons together as kids. Maybe it was time to see him again. But as she pondered the thought, another memory surfaced. A memory of how she had never told him how she had felt. They had shared so many moments, so many quiet exchanges. Yet when it came time to admit that she had fallen for him, Emma had backed away. She had left without saying goodbye, thinking that she could escape the vulnerability that came with love. It was easier to run, to hide behind the idea of a future she had yet to create. Emma exhaled slowly and stood up, walking over to the window. She could see the sparkling water of the bay in the distance. The gentle movement of the waves seemed to call to her, beckoning her to let go of the past and embrace what lay ahead. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her back to reality. It was a message from her best friend Mia. "You okay? I'm sure you'll feel right at home soon. Don't forget to breathe. You've got this." The message was exactly what she needed to hear. She smiled, tapping a quick response before slipping the phone back into her pocket. She had come here to find peace, to find a new sense of clarity. But deep down, she knew that in order to truly find what she was looking for, she would have to face the past. And maybe, just maybe, she would have to face Jason again too. Chapter 2. The unexpected meeting. The day slipped away as Emma settled back into the slow, peaceful pace of the town. She wandered around the local shops, the ones she used to visit with her mother. Tiny art galleries filled with local paintings, the small bakery with the smell of fresh pastries always wafting out the door, and the coffee shop by the beach where she had spent hours with her friends during high school. Everything felt like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the busy world beyond the coastline. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Emma walked along the familiar beach path that led to the old pier. The wind had picked up, ruffling her hair and sending a chill through the air. But the feeling of the sand beneath her feet, the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing, was comforting. It was as though time had slowed, giving her a chance to reflect, to breathe. The pier stretched out into the water like an old wooden skeleton, creaking softly in the wind. Emma had always loved it here, especially at sunset. It was the perfect spot to clear her mind. As she neared the end of the pier, she spotted a figure standing near the edge, looking out at the water, hands in his pockets. Her heart skipped a beat before she could even register why. There was something familiar about the figure, and when he turned slightly, she recognized him. It was Jason. He hadn't noticed her yet. His attention still focused on the horizon. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. She hadn't expected to see him here, not now. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, to avoid the inevitable conversation that she had been dreading for years. But another part of her, the part that had missed this town, missed him, couldn't resist. Taking a deep breath, Emma moved closer, her footsteps soft on the old wood. The sound of the ocean seemed to swallow up the space between them as she slowly approached. "Jason," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. He turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly in the fading light, as if trying to place her. Then his gaze softened. It only took a second for him to recognize her, and when he did, his face lit up with the warmest, most genuine smile. "Emma," he said, his voice rich and familiar, like a song she hadn't realized she'd been missing. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stood there, looking at each other, as if they were both unsure of what to say next. The last time they had spoken, it had been over a quick goodbye before she left for college. They had both promised to keep in touch, but life had pulled them in different directions. "You're back," he said, breaking the silence. He took a step toward her, the sound of his boots on the pier snapping her out of her daze. It's been, 5 years? 6, Emma replied quietly, her voice catching in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had missed hearing his voice until that moment. Jason's gaze softened, and for a moment, it was as if the years hadn't passed at all. I heard you were coming back, he said, his tone thoughtful. I didn't think I'd run into you so soon. Emma shrugged lightly, trying to hide the nervous flutter in her chest. I didn't expect it either. I just needed to come back, I guess. For a while. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her. I understand. Sometimes you need to come home to get things straight. There was a quiet sadness in his voice, but it was quickly replaced by a more playful tone. How's the big city life treating you? You look different. In a good way. Emma chuckled softly, the tension easing slightly. It's been a lot. Busy. But it's been a struggle to find myself in all the chaos. He smiled knowingly. Yeah, I get that. Life can have a funny way of throwing everything at you all at once. It's easy to forget what really matters. The conversation flowed easily, as if no time had passed at all. But despite the comfort of the moment, Emma couldn't ignore the underlying feeling that this meeting wasn't by accident. He was here, of all places, just when she was at a crossroads in her life, when she was questioning everything. But how much had changed since they were kids? Was it just the nostalgia of coming back to this place? Or was there something more between them that had never been fully addressed? She shook her head slightly, trying to dismiss the thought. She hadn't come back to this town to stir up old feelings. She had come for peace, for clarity, to rediscover who she was. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, just as real and present as the waves crashing beneath them. So, Jason said, leaning against the railing of the pier, you've probably heard I'm still running the marina. Emma nodded, her thoughts drifting for a moment as she took in the view. I remember you talking about taking it over one day. I'm glad you stuck with it. Yeah, he said with a small smile. It's been good. Keeps me busy. Sometimes I think I prefer the simplicity of the water to everything else. It's the one thing I don't mind getting lost in. There was something about his words that struck a chord in Emma. She understood the need to escape, to disconnect from the chaos. But was the simplicity of the water enough to fill the emptiness she felt inside? Was it enough for him? Before she could ask, Jason straightened up and turned to her with a more serious expression. Emma, I've been meaning to apologize. I never really got the chance when you left. For the way things ended between us. She looked up at him, her heart beating faster now. She had wondered, all these years, what would have happened if they had spoken about it. If they had acknowledged the feelings between them before she left. You don't owe me an apology, she replied, her voice softer than she intended. We were young. We both had our reasons for what happened. He sighed, looking out at the water. Yeah, but I think I always regretted not telling you how I felt. We never had that conversation. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the unspoken truth. The words that had always lingered between them, hanging in the air like an unfinished melody. The confession that she had never expected to hear, but had always hoped for. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open that door again. But then, just as quickly, he shifted back into his playful demeanor. Anyway, I'm glad you're back. Maybe you'll stick around this time, he said, trying to lighten the mood. Emma hesitated for a moment before answering, her heart still racing. Maybe. I'm not sure what I'm looking for yet. I guess I'll see where it takes me. Jason gave her a knowing smile. Well, no matter what, it's good to have you back. And in that moment, Emma realized that everything she had been running from had been right here all along. The past, the choices she had made, and the love she had left behind. It was all here, waiting to be rediscovered. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Truth. The night air had turned cooler by the time Emma and Jason decided to leave the pier. They walked slowly, side by side, towards the town. The steady rhythm of their footsteps on the wooden planks was the only sound in the otherwise quiet street. The sun had long disappeared, and the last remnants of the day's light clung to the horizon, casting a soft amber glow over the town. Emma couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Jason's apology. The words he hadn't said before, now spilling out like they were finally given a chance to breathe. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of her wanted to tell him that it didn't matter, that she had moved on, that she was here now to find herself again, not to revisit old wounds. But another part of her, one that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, longed to acknowledge the connection that had always been there between them. The feelings that had never really gone away, despite the distance, despite the time. As they approached the small cafe by the shore, Jason stopped and turned to face her. He looked almost hesitant, the light from the street lamps catching in his eyes, making them shimmer like the sea at night. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty that she wasn't used to hearing. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Emma replied, her voice soft, almost unsure of what was coming. Jason paused for a moment, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Do you ever think about us? About what happened back then?" Emma's heart raced in her chest. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so vulnerable. The question hung in the air between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap. "Sometimes," she admitted, her gaze drifting to the ground. "I think about it a lot more than I probably should." Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stood there, studying her face, as if looking for something she hadn't revealed yet. "I always wondered what would have happened if we hadn't let everything slip away so easily." She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. I thought we were too young, too caught up in our own lives to make it work. And when I left for college, I convinced myself that it was the right thing to do." She paused, her fingers nervously twisting together. "But maybe that was just an excuse. I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit how much I cared about you." Jason's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her. "I wasn't ready either," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I think we both ran because we were afraid. Afraid of what would happen if we gave in, if we let ourselves feel too much." Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settling in her chest. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of being vulnerable. I had always been the one who wanted control, who wanted to have everything figured out. But when it came to us, I didn't know how to handle it." Jason reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against hers. The contact was electric, warm, familiar yet new. He gave her a small smile, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I get it," he said quietly. "I don't think either of us knew what to do with all that we felt. It wasn't like anything else we had experienced. It wasn't easy, and we were both so young." Emma felt a lump form in her throat, the words she had been too afraid to say rushing to the surface. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I never meant to walk away without saying goodbye." Jason's gaze softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't hurt me, Emma. Not in the way you think. I don't regret anything that happened. But I do wonder. What if we hadn't let go so easily? What if we had taken a chance on each other?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Emma's mind raced as she considered what Jason was saying. Could things have been different? Could they have stayed together if they had fought for it? Or was it simply too late to turn back the clock? "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't change the past, can I? We both made choices. We both walked away." "I don't want to walk away from you now," Jason said, his voice full of emotion. "I don't want to let this moment slip through our fingers again. Not when we're finally standing here, finally able to talk about everything we left unsaid." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to say those words. Not after all these years. And yet, here they were. Two people who had circled each other for so long, only to realize they had never truly let go. "I don't want to walk away either," Emma replied softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I don't know if I can just pick up where we left off. Changed. You've changed. We're not the same people we were back then. Jason smiled, a small, understanding smile that made her heart ache. I know. But maybe we don't need to be the same people. Maybe we just need to be the people we are now, and take it one step at a time. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. Jason, the boy she had once known so well, the boy who had captured her heart with just a smile, was now standing before her as a man who had lived his own life, fought his own battles, and come through stronger. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but there was something in his eyes that told her he was willing to try, willing to see where this connection between them could go. I think I'd like that, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his hand still gently holding hers. Then let's see where it takes us, he said with a quiet intensity. The world around them seemed to pause, the sound of the waves becoming a distant hum, as if everything in the universe was holding its breath. They stood there for a moment, a mixture of old memories and new possibilities swirling between them, before Jason took a step forward and gently cupped her face in his hands. I never stopped thinking about you, Emma, he murmured, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, lingering kiss. The kiss was tender, hesitant at first, as though both of them were testing the waters, unsure of what to expect. But as the moment stretched on, their fears faded, and the familiarity of it all washed over them, like a puzzle finally falling into place, like the missing piece was back where it belonged. When they pulled away, they stood there for a moment, their foreheads resting together, their breaths shallow and synchronized. Emma's heart was racing, her pulse still thundering in her ears, but for the first time in years she felt at peace. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face, she wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, this time they wouldn't let go. Chapter 4. The Winds of Change. The days following Emma's unexpected reunion with Jason seemed to pass in a blur. There was an ease to their time together that Emma hadn't anticipated, an effortless quality to their conversations, as though they had never really been apart. They spent hours talking about the past, about their childhoods, about everything that had happened since they had lost touch. Jason had filled in the gaps of his life, telling her about the marina, about the people in town who had come and gone, and about the relationships he had explored but never quite found the depth he had once felt with her. Emma, in turn, shared the story of her years away. Her career, the relationships that had fizzled out, and the growing emptiness that had led her back to this place. But through it all, there was one thing they never fully addressed: the why of their separation. The reason why they hadn't fought for each other all those years ago. It lingered between them like a question mark, never quite being spoken, but always there, hovering in the background. One particularly warm afternoon, they found themselves walking along the cliffs above the town, the wind tousling their hair, the scent of the sea in the air. The landscape was as stunning as ever. The cliffs dropped dramatically into the ocean, and below them, the beach stretched out like an endless canvas of soft sand and sea foam. As they walked, Jason spoke first. His voice steady but filled with a hint of something Emma couldn't quite place. You know, he said, glancing at her, I've been thinking about what you said that night on the pier. About how you weren't ready to face it, to admit how much you cared. Emma glanced up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. She had known this conversation was coming, but the reality of it still felt like a wave crashing over her. Unexpected, overwhelming. I wasn't ready, Jason, she said, her voice a little softer than she intended. I thought that leaving was the easiest way out. I convinced myself that I needed to focus on my future, my career. I thought it was all about control. Jason stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. His eyes searched her face, studying her in a way that felt both comforting and intense. And now, are you ready? The question hung in the air between them, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had come back to this town seeking answers, seeking peace, but now that she was standing here with him, she wasn't sure if she could answer him honestly. Was she truly ready to face the possibility of reconnecting? Could she allow herself to feel the depth of what was between them, knowing the potential for pain? She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the cool stone of the cliff edge as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," she said honestly. I think I've been running from something for so long, I'm not sure if I know how to stop. I want to be with you, Jason, I really do. But there's a part of me that's terrified." "Terrified of what?" Jason asked, his voice low but full of genuine curiosity. "Of everything," Emma admitted. "Of diving back into something so intense, so real. Of being vulnerable again. After everything that's happened, I'm not sure I can trust myself to make the right choice." Jason stepped closer to her, his presence grounding her in a way that felt strangely comforting. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, the touch soft but sure. "Emma, you're not alone in this," he said quietly. "I know we both have our baggage, our reasons for why we didn't make it work before. But I think we've both changed. I'm not the same person I was when we were younger, and neither are you. But I'm willing to give this a shot if you are." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. It was clear he wasn't asking her to jump into something without thinking, without processing the weight of the decision. He wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for a chance, for both of them to take a step into the unknown together. "I don't know if I'm ready to promise forever," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this can go. I owe it to both of us to at least try." Jason smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "That's all I'm asking for, Emma. Just a chance." They stood there for a long time, their hands still intertwined, the weight of the conversation settling into a shared understanding. The breeze picked up, sending her hair flying into her face, and she couldn't help but laugh softly, brushing it away. For a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to evaporate, replaced by something far more comforting, a quiet optimism about the future, even if it was uncertain. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the ocean in deep shades of gold and purple, Emma turned to Jason with a sense of calm that she hadn't expected. "So, what now?" Jason grinned, his fingers gently tracing the back of her hand. "Now, we take it one step at a time. No pressure. Just two people trying to make something work." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the answer Emma needed. She wasn't ready to jump headfirst into a whirlwind romance, but she was willing to let herself explore the possibility of something real, something that could grow. They had both been burned by the past, but the present was a new beginning, a chance to rewrite their story together. As they continued to walk along the cliff's edge, the weight of the past still lingered in the distance, but Emma couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The ocean, vast and endless, stretched out before them, and in that moment, she felt like anything was possible. Chapter 5: New Beginnings. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments of discovery and tentative steps forward. Emma and Jason didn't rush anything. They let time do the work of rebuilding what had been broken, piece by piece. There was no grand declaration, no sudden spark of realization that everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Instead, there was the comfort of routine, the gradual easing of tension that had once existed between them, replaced now with something far more subtle, far more grounded. They spent afternoons at the marina, where Jason worked, teaching her about the boats, the tides, and the rhythms of life on the water. She'd always been a city girl, accustomed to the noise and bustle of the streets, but she quickly found peace in the quiet of the harbor. The rhythmic hum of the waves against the docks, the salty air, and the distant call of seagulls became her new soundtrack. Jason showed her how to tie knots, how to set sails, and how to navigate the world of boats in a way that felt natural to him but was utterly foreign to her. She loved every moment of it. But it wasn't just the learning that she cherished. It was the moments in between. The long pauses when they sat on the weathered benches by the water, watching the boats come and go. The stolen glances, the easy conversation about nothing at all, the way their hands would brush when they weren't trying. Everything felt new again, but different this time. They weren't teenagers lost in the chaos of first love anymore. They were adults, meeting each other where they were, not where they had been. Jason often took her out on the water, And it was during these trips that Emma truly felt the change. Out there on the open water, with nothing but the sky above them and the endless ocean around them, it was easy to forget the world. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two people side by side, learning to navigate the waters of life together. One evening, as the sun set in a brilliant display of pinks and oranges, they found themselves anchored just off the coast, the boat gently rocking in the calm waters. The air was warm, and the only sounds were the lapping of the waves and the soft creaking of the boat's wood. Jason sat next to her, his arm casually draped across the back of the bench, but the closeness between them felt far more intimate than anything either of them had ever experienced. Emma leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun's fading light on her skin. "This place," Emma said, her voice quiet, as though she were speaking to the sea itself. "It's like a world apart from everything else. I don't know how you can live here all the time and not feel like you're in a different universe." Jason chuckled softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think that's the point. This place, the water, it has a way of making you forget the noise, forget the chaos. Just thump. And I think we all need a little bit of that." Emma looked over at him, her heart swelling with something she didn't fully understand yet. His words were simple, but they resonated with her in a way that nothing else ever had. Jason had found a piece of the world that made sense to him, a place where he could breathe, a place that grounded him. And somehow, he had invited her into that world. "I think I've been searching for something like this," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Something real. Something that makes sense." Jason turned to face her, his expression unreadable for a moment, as though he were weighing his next words carefully. "You know, it's funny," he said slowly. "When we were younger, I thought I had everything figured out. But now, when I think about it, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just going through the motions, hoping things would fall into place." Emma nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I felt the same way," she admitted. "I was chasing things that didn't matter. I thought I had to have everything figured out, that I had to keep moving forward. But maybe I was just running from something. Maybe I was running from the parts of me that needed to slow down, to just breathe and be." Jason smiled then, a soft, understanding smile that made Emma's chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't prepared for. "Maybe we were both running," he said quietly. "But I think we're here now, exactly where we need to be." For a long time they didn't say anything. They just sat there together, letting the silence settle between them. The waves continued their gentle rhythm, and the sun slowly dipped beneath the horizon, casting the sky in deep purples and blues. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt in years. Everything felt so right, yet so fragile, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. She was terrified of the weight of this connection, of how quickly everything could unravel. But at the same time, she felt more at peace than she had in so long. "We can't predict what's going to happen," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But for right now, I think this is enough. I think I'm finally okay with that." Jason turned his head, his lips brushing the top of her hair, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "Me too, Emma. Me too." And for the first time since she had returned to this town, Emma truly believed it. She wasn't looking for answers anymore. She wasn't searching for something to fill the empty space inside of her. She had found it right here in this moment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Chapter 6. The Test of Time. For the next few weeks, Emma and Jason continued to explore this fragile but growing bond between them. There were still moments when Emma's past, her fears, would catch up to her like an unexpected storm, threatening to pull her back into the safety of the life she had built for herself. But then she'd look at Jason. His steady presence, the way he smiled at her like he had all the time in the world, and those fears would slowly fade like the receding tide. It was a kind of peace she hadn't expected to find, especially not here, not after everything. But it was there. In the quiet morning spent sipping coffee on the porch of the house by the water, In the late afternoon spent walking the beaches hand in hand, in the long, heartfelt conversations that stretched late into the night, Emma realized, perhaps for the first time, that life didn't need to be so complicated. She didn't have to have all the answers, all the plans. What mattered was the here and now. What mattered was the connection she shared with Jason. But as peaceful as everything seemed, the world outside the bubble they had created was starting to intrude. Jason's work at the marina had been busier than ever, and Emma's freelance projects were demanding more of her time. Though neither of them voiced it, there was an unspoken tension that grew between them as they tried to balance the happiness they had found with the demands of the outside world. One Saturday afternoon, Jason invited Emma to a local party that was being held at the marina. It was an annual event, a mix of friends, family, and people from the town. Emma had agreed to go, but a small part of her wasn't sure what to expect. She'd always been a bit of an outsider when it came to the people Jason knew, and the thought of being surrounded by unfamiliar faces made her feel uneasy. Still, she had learned to push past her comfort zone since coming back, so she decided to go with him. The marina was buzzing with energy when they arrived. People were chatting and laughing, drinks in hand, the sound of music drifting across the water. The scent of grilled seafood and fresh ocean air mingled in the atmosphere. It felt lively, almost festive, and for a moment, Emma felt like she was stepping into a world that was not her own, a world where she wasn't sure where she fit. Jason immediately became caught up in conversations with some old friends from the town, leaving Emma to navigate the crowd on her own. She tried to smile and make small talk with the people she knew, but there was a growing sense of discomfort in her chest. She wasn't used to this kind of social scene anymore. The small town dynamics, the shared history, it all felt like something she didn't belong to. She glanced around the crowd, spotting Jason laughing with a group near the edge of the dock, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, despite being with him, she was alone. After what felt like an eternity, she excused herself and stepped away from the party, making her way down to the docks. The sound of the waves crashing against the boats was a welcome relief. The air felt cooler here, and the chaos of the party was a distant hum. She took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts, when she heard a voice behind her. "Emma!" She turned around to see Jason standing there, a concerned look on his face. He had clearly noticed her absence. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "I just needed some air." Jason approached her slowly, his eyes scanning her face. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though she knew he could see through the lie. "It's just, I don't really fit in with all that. I don't know anyone here, Jason. It's just hard." He stepped closer, his presence steady and comforting. "You're not alone, Emma. Not with me." She met his gaze, and for the first time that day, she felt a little more grounded. His words were simple, but they meant everything to her. Jason didn't see her as an outsider. He saw her as his. That was more than enough. "I know," she said softly. "I know. But sometimes I feel like I'm still trying to figure out where I belong. It's hard being back here. Everything's different, and yet it all feels so familiar. It's like I'm stuck between two worlds, and neither one fully makes sense anymore." Jason took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "I get it," he said. "I do. But you belong here with me. Whatever this is, whatever this becomes, I'm not going anywhere. And I want you to know that." Emma felt a lump in her throat, the vulnerability of the moment hitting her harder than she expected. She had been running for so long, not just from her past, but from the uncertainty of her own future. She had never allowed herself to truly settle, never let herself feel the weight of a connection so deep. "I'm scared," she whispered, the confession slipping from her lips before she could stop it. "I'm scared that I'm going to mess this up, that I'm going to pull away again when things start to feel real. I've done it before, Jason. I've always found a way to walk away." Jason stepped closer, pulling her into his arms. For a moment, Emma didn't resist, letting herself be enveloped in his warmth. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, but now in his arms, those walls seemed unnecessary. "You don't have to be scared. Jason murmured against her hair. We'll take this one step at a time, Emma. No rush, no pressure. We don't need to have it all figured out right now. They stood there in silence, the only sound the soft lap of the water against the dock. Emma closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to just be. No expectations, no fear. Just this moment with Jason by her side. The truth was, she didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future would hold, or whether they would make it through the challenges that would inevitably come their way. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that they had this. And it was enough. Chapter 7. The Depths of the Heart. The weeks that followed were a turning point for both Emma and Jason. They continued to explore their growing connection, but now with a new sense of clarity. The cracks in Emma's walls were starting to show, and though she was still cautious, the fear that once held her back began to slowly dissolve. Jason, too, seemed to be a man transformed. The quiet confidence he exuded when they were together spoke volumes of how far they had come, not just since their youth, but since that first hesitant step they had taken back into each other's lives. One crisp autumn morning, Emma woke early. The sun had barely crested the horizon, and the world outside was still shrouded in the mist of early morning fog. She had always loved mornings like this, calm, still, and full of promise. But today something felt different. A quiet restlessness churned inside her, the kind of unease that had become familiar over the past few weeks. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the remnants of old habits. But the feeling lingered, as though a storm was brewing on the horizon. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding Jason already awake, sitting by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. His usual calm demeanor was slightly absent, and Emma noticed the way his brow furrowed in thought. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice breaking the stillness of the early morning. Jason looked up, his gaze a bit distant. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied. "I know things have been good between us, Emma, but there's something I can't shake. I've been feeling like something's about to change." Emma hesitated. She had been feeling the same way. She had buried it deep, thinking it was just her own insecurities acting up, but Jason's words made her feel like she wasn't alone in that uncertainty. "Do you mean something between us?" she asked cautiously, even though her heart already knew the answer. He set his cup down, standing up to face her. His expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "I don't know, but I feel like we're both holding back in some way. We've both been through so much, especially you, and I want to be here for you, Emma. But I also don't want us to be stuck in the past. I think it's time we fully faced whatever's been standing between us." The weight of his words sank in. Emma could feel her heart pounding against her chest, the old fears surfacing. They had been moving forward, yes, but always with the knowledge that something unspoken was lingering beneath the surface. She had tried to push it aside, to pretend that it wasn't there, but now, standing before Jason, it felt impossible to ignore. "I don't want to hold back anymore," she said quietly. "But I don't know if I'm ready to confront everything from the past. There's so much I've buried, Jason. So much that I haven't dealt with, and I'm scared that if we try to dig it all up, I'll lose you in the process." Jason stepped closer, his eyes softening as he reached out to take her hand. "I don't think you'll lose me, Emma. But I think we have to face it together. We can't keep dancing around the hard stuff. If we want something real, something lasting, then we have to be honest. All the way. With each other, and with ourselves." His words pierced through her defenses. Emma's chest tightened as the weight of what he was asking her to do settled in. For the first time, she truly understood that love wasn't just about being together in the easy moments. It was about standing together through the storms, facing the darkest parts of each other and still choosing to be there. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know you're right." Jason squeezed her hand gently, his touch grounding her. "Then let's take this one step at a time. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. We'll face it, and we'll do it together." That morning, after Jason had gone to work, Emma sat in silence, the quiet of the house wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Her mind swirled with memories she had spent years suppressing, moments of pain, regret, and unanswered questions. She knew it wasn't fair to drag Jason into it all without first facing her own demons. But how could she ever expect to move forward to truly be with him, if she didn't first deal with the past that had haunted her for so long? By midday, Emma made a decision. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had long avoided, her mother's. It had been years since they had spoken, a chasm of time and resentment standing between them. But Jason's words had ignited something inside her. The need for closure, for healing. The phone rang 3 times before it was picked up. Emma! Her mother's voice was tentative, as if she hadn't expected her to call. Hi, Mom, Emma said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. I think it's time we talked. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with long pauses and careful words. But as Emma forced herself to speak the truths she had buried deep, the floodgates opened. She talked about the abandonment she had felt as a child, the loneliness that had followed her throughout her life, and the hurt that had festered in her heart for so long. Her mother, for the first time in years, apologized, genuinely, without reservation. It wasn't a magical solution, and Emma knew that healing would take time, but the release of speaking those words out loud was like shedding a heavy coat she had worn for far too long. By the time the conversation ended, Emma felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't healed, not yet. But she had taken the first step, and that felt like a victory. Later that night, when Jason returned to the house, Emma was waiting for him. She didn't need to say much. He could see the shift in her eyes, the quiet determination. She had faced something today. She had let go of a piece of her past, and in doing so, had made room for something new. She sat beside him on the porch, the stars twinkling above them, the night air cool and crisp. She turned to him, her voice filled with vulnerability but also hope. I talked to her, Emma said softly. Jason didn't need to ask who she meant. He simply pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulder, offering the comfort and support she needed. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Like I've taken the first step. There's still a long way to go, but I'm ready to face it, Jason. All of it. I'm ready to be real with you. And with myself. Jason kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering there for a moment. Then we'll do it together. Step by step. And in that moment, as the cool night wrapped around them, Emma finally felt like she was no longer running. She was standing still, grounded in the present, facing the future. Not alone, but with Jason by her side. Chapter 8. The Hidden Truths. The days after Emma's conversation with her mother felt like a quiet exhale, the kind of relief that comes after years of holding your breath. The space between her and Jason was filled with something unspoken but undeniable. Trust. They had shared a vulnerable moment, and though it was one small step, it felt like a giant leap towards something deeper. Yet, even as Emma embraced this new chapter, she couldn't help but sense that there were still things neither of them had fully acknowledged. Things still hidden beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, their bond continued to grow, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Emma couldn't escape the nagging feeling that Jason, too, was hiding something. There were moments when his eyes seemed distant, when the words he spoke didn't quite match the thoughts she sensed behind them. She had learned enough to know that silence was often a sign of something being kept back. But she wasn't ready to push. Not yet. Jason, for his part, was patient, never rushing her, never pressuring her to move faster than she was ready for. He knew the process of healing, of confronting one's demons, was long and complicated. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that there was something waiting just beneath the surface, something that would test the very foundation they had built. It came on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of night where the sun slipped below the horizon with ease, and the sky turned a soft shade of lavender. Emma was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, humming along to an old playlist she'd created years ago. Jason had promised to help, but he was preoccupied with something on his phone. It wasn't unusual. He had become more involved with the marina recently, and his work often kept him busy well into the evening. But as she glanced over her shoulder to ask him for help with chopping vegetables, she saw something that made her freeze. Jason was staring at his phone with an intensity that was unfamiliar to her. His eyes were narrowed, his fingers gripping the device a little too tightly. She could see the faint light of a message, but the words were too small for her to read from where she stood. "Jason?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty she hadn't intended. He looked up immediately, his expression shifting into something that was too quick to hide. "Hey, sorry, just finishing up a work thing," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket with a little too much haste. Emma nodded, though something about his reaction didn't sit right with her. She told herself to let it go. He was busy, that was all. But as she moved about the kitchen, the feeling of unease persisted, like a tiny pebble lodged in her shoe. She couldn't shake the thought that there was more to the situation than he was letting on. Later that night, after dinner, they settled into the living room. Jason sat beside her on the couch, the two of them watching a movie, but Emma could feel the distance between them widening. His mind seemed to be elsewhere, his attention divided. The intimacy of their earlier days, the quiet moments shared over coffee or walks by the water, was gone. And though she longed to reach out to bridge that gap, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not without knowing what was happening beneath the surface. When the credits rolled on the movie, Emma made a decision. She couldn't continue to ignore the feeling that there was something important being hidden. She turned to Jason, her voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. "Jason, is everything okay?" she asked, watching him closely. Jason paused, clearly taken aback by the question. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that told her he was uncomfortable. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just work stuff. Nothing to worry about." Emma held his gaze, her heart beating faster now. "It's not just that. I can tell something's going on. You've been distracted lately. And I don't know. It feels like you're pulling away from me." Jason's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Emma swore she saw something like guilt in them. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he stopped, closing his eyes as though he were collecting his thoughts. "I don't want to hurt you, Emma," he said finally. His voice soft, the words heavy with meaning. "But there's something I haven't told you, something I've been carrying around for a long time. I was just trying to figure out how to tell you without making things worse." Emma's chest tightened, the unease turning to fear. Her mind raced, trying to prepare for whatever was about to come. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or to turn away. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason hesitated, his hands running over his face as if trying to ward off the weight of the truth. "Before you came back to town, I was involved with someone. It wasn't serious, but it meant something to me at the time. And when you showed up again, I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to confuse things between us. But the truth is, I've been carrying that guilt, and I didn't want you to feel like you were second choice, or that I wasn't fully invested in us." Emma sat there in stunned silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The words felt like a punch to her gut, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. "You were seeing someone?" she asked finally, her voice a mix of confusion and hurt. While we were reconnecting." Jason nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to lose what we were building. I didn't want to risk it, Emma." The room felt suddenly too small, too heavy. Emma pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as though trying to protect herself from the hurt that had suddenly overtaken her. She didn't know what to say, how to process the information. She had always been open with him, vulnerable with him, and now it felt like the foundation they had built together had been cracked just like that. "I don't know what to say, Jason," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I thought we were moving forward, but now I feel like I was just a placeholder. I thought you were being honest with me, and now I don't know what's real anymore." Jason reached for her hand, but Emma pulled away, not ready to let him in just yet. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but deeper still was the sense of confusion. How could she trust everything they'd built if this had been hidden from her? "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice full of regret. "I love you, Emma, and I know I've messed up. But please, don't let this destroy what we have. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." But Emma wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. The weight of his confession hung between them, and for the first time in weeks, the distance between them felt insurmountable. She needed time. Time to think. Time to process. Because what she felt for Jason was real. But now she wasn't sure if it was enough to heal the fractures that had just been exposed. "I need space, Jason," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "I need to think." Jason nodded, his face etched with remorse. "I understand. Take all the time you need." As Emma stood and walked to the door, she knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. But whether it was the beginning of something new, or the unraveling of everything they had built, only time would tell. Chapter 9: The Space Between Us. The days following that conversation were some of the hardest Emma had ever experienced. She didn't see Jason for nearly a week, except for brief, awkward exchanges when he would come by to check on her, or when they would run into each other in passing. The space between them felt endless, as if they were two strangers living in the same house, no longer able to bridge the gap that had suddenly appeared between them. Emma spent most of her time at the house, trying to figure out her emotions, her thoughts, and most of all, her heart. She had asked for space, but as the days went on, she realized that it wasn't just Jason she was distancing herself from. She was pulling away from everything. The town, the memories, even the work she had once found so fulfilling. It was as if, in that one moment of raw honesty between her and Jason, the entire world had tilted on its axis, and she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. She sat on the back porch one afternoon, staring out at the water, her legs crossed beneath her as she tried to breathe through the confusion. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the horizon, but she didn't feel the peace she had once felt during these moments. Instead, her mind was clouded by questions that had no easy answers. Could she trust Jason again? Could she ever forget the fact that he had kept such an important part of his life hidden from her? Or was it a mistake that they could work through? It was strange how the heart could hold so many contradictions. She loved him, she knew that. But love, as she had come to realize, was not always enough. There was something deeper she needed from him. Something rooted in trust, in transparency. And right now that felt shaky at best. The sound of the front door creaking open pulled Emma from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Jason's presence had a way of filling the space around him, making everything seem still, as though even the world itself was waiting for his next move. "Emma!" His voice was soft, tentative. "Can we talk?" She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before turning to face him. He was standing a few feet away, looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as both apologetic and hopeful. She couldn't help but notice how worn he seemed. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his posture was slightly slouched, as if he carried the weight of their silence on his shoulders. "Of course," she replied quietly, her voice betraying none of the emotions swirling inside her. Jason hesitated before taking a few steps toward her. He stood a few feet away, unsure of whether to get any closer. He seemed to be waiting for an invitation, as though unsure whether she was ready to let him in again. "I know you've been taking space," he said, his eyes searching hers. "And I respect that. But I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Emma's stomach tightened at his words. She had expected this conversation, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the guilt, and I realized that there's something even bigger I've been holding back." He paused, as if trying to find the right words. "The woman I was seeing. It wasn't just some casual thing. It was serious for a while, but I ended it before you came back. I didn't want to bring that baggage into this, and I thought I could just leave it all behind. But the truth is, I should have been upfront with you from the start. And I'm sorry I wasn't." Emma felt her heart race. This was the truth she had been waiting for, but it didn't feel like the relief she had hoped for. She had always believed that honesty, no matter how painful, would be the answer. But now, faced with Jason's confession, it felt like a heavy burden that neither of them could easily bear. "I wish you would have told me sooner," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when I feel like I don't know who you are anymore." Jason's eyes softened, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I know, and I'm sorry. I've hurt you and I can't take that back. But I need you to know this. It's over. I've been trying to make sense of everything I've been carrying. My past, my mistakes, and I've realized that all I want, all I care about is being here with you. I don't want anyone else, Emma. I never have." The sincerity in his voice shook her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she could believe him. But the cracks in their foundation were deep, and the fear that this would only end in more heartbreak crept back into her chest. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice catching. "But right now, I can't help but wonder if I'm just the rebound. If you're just using me to forget what happened. I need you to show me that this is real, Jason. That we're real." Jason took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm worthy of your trust. I know I've messed up, but I'm here. I'm all in, Emma. And I'll keep showing up day after day, until you believe that what we have is worth fighting for." Emma's heart wavered. She saw the raw honesty in his eyes, the vulnerability he had never shown before. This was not the Jason she had known all those years ago, the one who had avoided confrontation and buried his feelings. This was a man who had learned from his mistakes, who was willing to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful. And for the first time since the confession, she felt a flicker of hope. "I need time," Emma said softly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. "But I'm not saying goodbye. I just need to figure out if we can rebuild this. If we can rebuild us." Jason nodded, his expression one of understanding. "Take all the time you need, Emma. I'll be here waiting. I'm not going anywhere." Emma exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past few days lift ever so slightly. There was still so much work to be done, so many questions to answer, but in this moment she realized something important. She wasn't alone anymore. No matter how hard things got, Jason was willing to stand beside her, even when it was hard. That, for now, was enough. And maybe, just maybe, it could be the foundation of something beautiful. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The weeks following the difficult conversation were a slow, tentative journey. Emma and Jason remained in close proximity, but they navigated their connection carefully, each of them respecting the other's need for space and time to process everything that had been uncovered. The silence between them was no longer filled with distrust, but with a sense of anticipation, the quiet before the storm as they both waited for the dust to settle. Jason kept his promise to her. He showed up every day, not with grand gestures, but with the simple, quiet consistency of someone determined to make things right. He'd bring her coffee in the morning, sometimes flowers, and other times just an unexpected text, asking how her day was going. He never pushed her to talk about things she wasn't ready to confront, but he also never ran from the uncomfortable conversations when they came. Emma, for her part, found herself beginning to soften. She had spent so much of her life guarded, afraid of letting anyone in too deeply. But with Jason, she started to understand that love wasn't just about accepting the perfect parts of someone. It was about embracing the brokenness, the mistakes, and the vulnerability, and learning to grow through them together. She didn't know if they could ever truly get back to where they had been, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something even stronger, something more real. One evening, as fall gave way to the crisp chill of winter, Jason invited her out to dinner. They had kept their interactions mostly quiet and intimate, small moments spent in the comfort of her home or long walks along the shore, but tonight was different. Tonight he wanted to take her out, to show her that he was serious about moving forward. And for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a spark of excitement, a glimmer of hope for what could be. She met him at a small Italian restaurant in the heart of town, the kind with dim lighting and cozy tables that gave off the feeling of intimacy. When she arrived, Jason was already seated at a table by the window, watching the falling snow outside. He stood when he saw her, a warm smile spreading across his face as he walked over to greet her. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes lingering on hers. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Emma replied, her heart skipping a beat. There was something in his gaze tonight, something different from the guarded look that had been there before. It was a softness, a kind of tenderness that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. They sat down, and the conversation flowed easily between them. They talked about everything: work, their families, what they'd been reading, the small, silly things that came to mind. It felt like they were no longer the people caught in the wake of past mistakes, but two people discovering each other all over again. Emma couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease, so in the moment. It was a peaceful evening, free from the weight of expectation. After the meal, they walked outside into the quiet streets, the snow falling softly around them. The town felt still, as if the whole world had slowed down just for them. Jason took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a gentle confidence. "I've been thinking about something," he said as they walked, his voice hesitant but earnest. "About the future. About us." Emma stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. The look on his face was sincere, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt her heart begin to open, like a flower unfurling in the warmth of the sun. "What about us?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to make any promises that I can't keep," Jason said, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand. "But I know this. I love you, Emma, and I want to build something with you. I know we've been through a lot, but I believe in us. I believe in this." Emma felt her throat tighten as she looked into his eyes. The sincerity in his words matched the intensity of the emotions that swirled within her. She had fought so hard to protect herself, to keep her heart safe. But in this moment, with Jason standing before her, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she could take a leap of faith. "I love you too," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "And I want to see where this goes. I want to try to build something real, something lasting. I don't know if it will work, but I'm willing to find out. With you." Jason's face broke into a smile so genuine and full of relief that it nearly took Emma's breath away. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, their hearts beating in sync as the snow continued to fall around them. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grounding her in the present moment. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt like she could breathe without the weight of the past hanging over her. It wasn't just about forgiving Jason, it was about forgiving herself too. Letting go of the fear that had kept her stuck, that had made her second-guess everything. She was ready to take the next step, to open herself up to the possibility of a future that didn't include the ghosts of her past. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world seemed to disappear. There was no more uncertainty, no more doubt. Just them, together, in the quiet of the falling snow, ready to face whatever came next. Emma realized that love wasn't about perfection. It was about the willingness to try, to grow, and to take risks. And with Jason by her side, she was ready to take those risks. To leap, and hope that the landing would be as beautiful as the fall. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The relationship between Emma and Jason continued to deepen. They worked through the complexities of their past, learning to communicate more openly, to give each other the space to grow individually while building something together. It wasn't always easy, but they were committed. They both had scars, but together they were learning how to heal them. One sunny spring afternoon, as they sat on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the world go by, Emma looked at Jason with a contented smile. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd be here. With you. Not after everything. But now, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Jason squeezed her hand, his eyes soft as he leaned in to kiss her forehead. "Neither can I, Emma. Neither can I." They had come a long way, and though there were still challenges to face ahead, They were no longer the same people who had started this journey. They were stronger, braver, and more open to love than they had ever been before. And for the first time in a long while, Emma believed that anything was possible, that love, when given the chance, could overcome even the deepest of wounds. And as they sat there side by side, watching the world continue on, Emma knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning.